Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Hotlines and Investigations Working Group Report webinar. My name is Casey Williams, and I am the events coordinator here at the ECI. I also run all of our working groups and our fellows working groups. So for today's webinar, we actually had around 40 members RSVP to this call, and this 1-hour presentation is on one of our ECI's past working groups, known as Hotlines and Investigations. It will be led by the co-chairs of the group, and they will be talking with you all about the development of the report and their focus of having a centralized hotline and investigation function within your organization. So I do see a couple of familiar names, but just to give you a little background of ECI working groups. So basically, these groups are in an effort to encourage networking and collaboration among its members. So we offer multiple working group opportunities, which are based on certain issues that are driven by member interest. And the point of these member groups is to help the ECI members learn from one another via dialogue through the sharing of resources. And then the shared goal of these working groups is to produce a practical, action-oriented deliverable for the benefit of the ECI members. So as you all know, we are using the Zoom platform. Because there are about 30 to 40 participants on the call today, I did go ahead and have it to where it would put everyone on mute. So if you do have a question or have any comments or anything, please use the chat function. It is at the bottom of the screen. And just as a heads up, I am recording this webinar today. So I would say probably next week is when I will have it available to the ECI membership, and that will be posted on our website. So as far as our agenda goes today, we will have the introduction of the speakers, the presentation, open discussion, and concluding remarks and next steps. So for introductions, joining us today is our co-chairs from the working group. We have Jennifer Prisco from Red Lion Controls and Jim Smith from the Boeing Company. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Jen and Jim.
Thank you, Casey. So this is Jen speaking, and I want to start off by thanking the membership of the working group. Jim, I'm sure feels the same way. I thought we had a really wonderful group of representatives from a broad range of companies, some big, some small, some in between. Various sectors were represented, private companies, public companies. It really fleshed out the collective input in a way where, you know, the paper was a cross-representation of, you know, all different thought processes coming from different organizations based on their size, you know, the relative financial support of compliance within that organization, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of our objective of having, you know, collective input of what works well and what does not on a variety of levels, I felt that the membership really helped us reach that objective. And everyone was just very pleasant to work with. We made a lot of collegiate connections along the way that, you know, we are very important to us, and you know, we will utilize going forward as you know, compliance questions come up within our respective organizations. Casey, can you advance the slides for me, please? Great. Maybe go to slide 2 because I've already, thank you. So basically what we sought to do was, you know, have a series of group discussions around these topics, these, you know, hotline and investigation topics, get some group think going, and you know, then, you know, also survey the membership for some very precise feedback on what their current programs basically were comprised of. As a result of those discussions, we devised the paper into 5 program elements, each one sort of representing a tier of what we felt was a particular, program, element, things that would be required sort of as a toll gate. And you'll see if you look at the paper, that I think we achieved a pretty good flow to make, our group think fairly comprehensive. Could you go to the next slide, Casey? Great. And of course, we didn't just take into account what companies were presently doing or what we each independently brought to the table with insofar as our opinions and experience, but we also took into account sources of expert sources on topic, right? So U.S. Department of Justice, as you may know, recently issued revised guidelines for corporate compliance programs. In that guidance were updated, fill-up factors, as they are known, which basically identifies core elements for, an effective reporting and investigation function. And we also took into consideration, the SEC laws on point, Sarbanes-Oxley, whistleblower procedures that are incumbent upon audit committees to establish as part of being a public company. Next slide. Oh, and we're already at the methodology. I'll turn it over to Jim for this.
Great, thanks, Jen. So this is Jim Smith here. I'm going to go over the first program element, the ensuring quality investigations. And as Jen talked about, what you'll see in the paper is the reference to the fill-up factors. When we wrote that, we had the guidance from February of 2017. So references to that in the paper are related to the prior version, and the DOJ just came out last week with the revisions. Much of it is the same. There is one section that I'll talk about a little bit later that is included, but for this paper still meshes with the new guidance. The DOJ just provided some more explanation, as well as three essentially overarching questions to look at when evaluating a program's methodology. And of course, investigations is part of that. So those three overarching questions are, is the corporation's compliance program well designed? Secondly, is the program being applied earnestly and in good faith? And lastly, does the corporation's compliance program work in practice? So essentially, we want more than just a paper program. We want a program that is effective in what it's doing. And the one additional section that was added here just on April 30th is one that's titled Investigation of Misconduct. And there's 4 areas within that. They're looking at the effectiveness, essentially, of the investigative function. Is it well functioning? Is it appropriately funded? And are you seeing timely, thorough investigations? And so keep those 3 overarching questions, and then specifically related to investigations, in mind as we walk through this presentation and you read the paper. What you'll see is a theme around consistency. Is your program consistent? Is it standardized? Is it developed or well developed? And what we have here in the paper and on this webinar is the best practices from the collective of over 30 companies, with a consensus around what are the commonalities, what are we doing, both to, as Jen said, try and comply with those fill-up factors or with other regulatory requirements. And so the first one you see here is the investigative methodology. And essentially, you want to make sure that we have fair and objective investigations, that we're not out on witch hunts, that everything is based on evidence that is obtained or available, and reaching those reasonable conclusions. Companies need to ensure this per that DOJ guidance. How you get there is through consistent processes. And so essentially, have you made that earnest and good faith effort? Where is that going to come from? Through having a legitimate function, investigative function, and having the consistent processes. The groups, the member organizations that participated talked about having a unified standard protocol. So you want to evaluate, do you have a documented investigations process? How you go about conducting your investigations? Are you observed as a function throughout the organization to conduct those investigations? And is it a single function? That's ideal. Not every company can do that. Obviously, these are best practices to be taken as you can do that with resources and funding and whatnot. But we did find it to be a best practice to have a single function, if possible, that governs your investigative function. You'll see the continuous stakeholder feedback and customer feedback. You might ask, what is that? That could be surveying or just getting participants in the investigation process. Are you getting their feedback? That's important because the DOJ asks you for continuous improvement. That we need to care about, you need to care about how effective our program is, and are we looking at ways to have that continuous improvement. Again, I mentioned having a well-defined, well-developed process, and we'll go into these specifically, but the intake triage process, do you have standard intake questions? Are you going through and getting that information where you can do a timely and thorough investigation right out the gate from when somebody reports an issue? Are you utilizing a case plan to understand your scope? And that's one thing the DOJ talked about, was having a properly scoped investigation. That all begins at the beginning when you're obtaining the allegations. Do you know what you're looking into? Do you really know where to go in your investigation and where to collect that evidence? And do you have a burden of proof? So the working group talked about the preponderance standard is the norm. Preponderance is more likely than not. Some organizations will use a higher standard, especially if termination of an employee is going to occur. But whatever you want a standard burden of proof. You don't want that shifting standard to happen in the organization. Next slide. Another area is your investigator preparedness. The DOJ comments on this, talking about qualified personnel. And so what were the best practices related to that? You can't just throw people into investigations. It's a difficult area. It does require skill sets and training. And so the participating companies talked about establishing a training curriculum. You want to have some minimum standard of training. Some of the things you see there on the screen, what are your investigative principles? What is your burden of proof, for example? How will you do your reports? What are some interview techniques, those soft skills? You see soft skills training there on the slide. How are you training your people in those areas? They might be great investigators, but they might be terrible in the interview room. Are you seeing those areas? Are you doing that continuous improvement with your investigators? What is your record keeping methodology? What do you do as a company related to confidentiality? How will you outbrief a reportant or a respondent? Those sorts of things. We also talked about that companies generally have onboarding, regularly scheduled trainings, and some sort of refresher session if you're certified, or some combination of those, that it's not a one and done, or you don't train people at all when they move into the investigative function, and that you want some sort of tracking system. You want to keep track of what people have done. It's a best practice to have some sort of certification where the company has a minimum standard, and we all make sure that people have done that. And every 3 years was the consensus, that just understanding resource needs and that sort of thing. Plus they're learning on the job, they're doing the job every day. As I mentioned, the soft skills training, as well as different tools. So both resources outside of formal training, so are there peer mentors? Are there SMEs, those subject matter experts to go to? Do you have templates available, quick reference guides, those sorts of things? All of these you see here, and even more so in the paper, help you with investigator preparedness, because that's expected. Next slide. And then independence of the function. There is mention in the Philip factors whether the investigations were independent and whether the program or the overarching program has autonomy. And so, go back one slide. There we go. So your hotline and investigation function, we had much discussion around siloing, essentially the partitions between groups, and the participating organizations all agreed that where you can break down silos, it's better. that you want to try to have integrity and defensibility in your process. And if you're siloed, you won't be sharing information. You might have duplicate information, investigating the same thing twice or more, and that you want to be unified to the greatest extent possible. Some options that you see there: do you have dedicated or part-time investigators? Understanding not every company can have full-time dedicated staff. Most of the companies have part-time investigators who are doing it off the side of their desk or as a secondary task. Again, you want to make sure they're qualified to do so, but that's certainly possible as long as there's alignment and it's not scattered about. That second bullet there is the internal function oversight. So do you have an ombuds, for example, who's an independent company representative, or is it represented by one of the functions that you see there? This was all over the place depending on the company's setup, whether it was law or ethics, HR, safety, security, risk management, forensic audit functions. All of those you see on the screen represent the various oversight functions, internal functions from our working group that oversaw investigations. Whatever your choice, the goal is to have it be a unified front and not have each one of those doing their own thing, because that will lead to inconsistency. And then some sort of dotted line reporting responsibility, that you just don't want a straight line up to the organization's leader, that you do want oversight for transparency, that oversight and accountability. That's a best practice to have some sort of dotted line reporting relationship to a board. Next slide. Another area the DOJ will ask about is fair and consistent discipline. Is it fair? Is it consistent? And if it's disparate, if you're not consistent, why? And being able to explain that. And so you want to see that it's even more than just discipline. It's also remedial actions. It's actions being taken to try and do preventive actions, try and prevent this in the future. And you want to make sure that that's carried out. You want a consistent response to any sort of matter. You'll see there that the representative organizations did have commonality in terms of what your case should include. Again, you want to have findings of fact. You don't want it based on speculation. You want to meet your burden, make sure there's some sort of analysis of the evidence. Again, the DOJ will look at that, a conclusion, and the proposed action plan. What next steps are you going to do, and including contributing factors. There's a section, program element 5, that we'll talk about a little bit later. This is kind of the new frontier for many companies, but you do want to look at why did this occur? Not just that it occurred and did you substantiate it, but why, and what is going to be done about it. We do recommend using a defined or an ad hoc review committee. So essentially a disciplinary board or a committee, so that the discipline is not in the hands of just one person, where personalities can come into play or emotions around a particular incident. And so to have some sort of framework where you can utilize committees for that. Lastly, we want to make sure that reporters are outbriefed. We want to make sure that employees build trust, that we build trust with employees, and employees trust the process, that we thank them for raising concerns. And we had discussions around how much courage it takes to step forward, that we want employees to feel comfortable with coming forward, because ultimately employees will go somewhere with their concerns. And we want them to stay within the company, let us know so that we can look into it rather than going outside either to attorneys or to regulatory agencies. And ultimately, how we respond to them will spread, whether that's positive or negative, and we want them to remain within the company. Essentially, we want to have an effective process and not essentially drive people out. And so the next slide, Jen's going to talk about program element 2.
Thanks, Jim. So as we proceed through this sort of investigatory gates process, it's really important that we recognize that, each element supports the other, in that if you have a quality investigation process and a program, it's going to lend credibility to the program itself, and it's going to create trust and assurance within your employee community that issues that are raised are handled appropriately and with the right level of attention and ethical compass. So it's really, really important that your investigators are tooled up to handle things swiftly, discreetly, and in a way that is, completely fair and objective, so that your program is healthy. And notwithstanding all of those efforts, it's also necessary to actively communicate the existence of the program and the resources through which employees can speak up. And there's no greater way to do this than tone from the top. So the group talked a lot about getting executive commitment to a hotline and investigation function, to a compliance function, making sure that expectations were set, that employees speak up. Enabling a transparent environment, making sure that people didn't feel deterred from having a voice, making sure that middle management effectively bought in. So, assuring that we didn't have situations in our companies that, where middle management, fearful for, having these escalations be, an indictment of their business practices, basically shut down channels, right? Making sure that there was, active communication around expectations of compliance. So all of these things sort of come together to really set the stage for, having that robust program and creating a level of awareness that is going to support the continuum of that program. Simply hanging posters, passing out literature, that's often done, but it's not going to, create a robust program. You really need to talk the talk, in addition to, offering advertising. Next slide, Casey. And when we do distribute materials, we really need to make sure that the distributions are effective. So, for example, making sure materials are multilingual, making sure that they're relatable to, the different business functions, understanding what the local concerns are, right? And you can do this through engagement surveys or, a number of ethics assessments or outreach efforts to get a general pulse on, how the employees are feeling. One of the things that I think we agreed upon as a group was this notion that, if employees are not feeling valued, if they're basically disengaged because the work environment is not what they'd like it to be, then they're not going to report on compliance issues, for example. And so, the training and the town halls that maybe you would do around the availability of a program would be tailored to focusing on, those concerns which the employees in the audience would foremost have, right, based on those engagement surveys. And that goes a long way towards, building the traction. When we have situations where, there's substantiated allegations within a particular business, if the management acts poorly in response to a substantiated allegation and fails to, execute the right kind of discipline, or fails to align with the intent of the program and the ethical commitments the company makes, that can be a real negative message to the employee groups, and it can really go a long way to to thwart your efforts. And so, continuously, as a compliance leader, as a person in a company that oversees a hotline and investigation function, voicing, to management, marketing to them just as much to the employees on the importance of, having this function, what can be gained from this function, how it can eliminate corruption, how it can assure, a good, robust working environment with engaged employees, in exchange for their support for when, investigations turn up, bad things, is really essential. to the continued vitality of the function. So not only are you talking to, the broader employee communities, but you're constantly reselling management teams and the executive on the importance of having this function. And I believe with the next slide, we move into program element 3, and I'll pass it back to Jim.
Thanks. So as things come in, one of the areas that the working group talked about, and it's an area where balls can be dropped, where there can be gaps, is in that intake triage, the assignment of allegations. So where do they go? How do they come in? What do you do with them when the allegations come in? And the working group felt that how they're responded to, how they're received, how quickly they are, the manner and speed in which they're addressed was of critical importance. And that's echoed in that DOJ guidance that talks about a thorough and timely investigation. And so when it comes in, are you keeping metrics on the intake triage, essentially assignment function? As I mentioned before, there's an expectation by the DOJ to have continuous improvement. And unless you're measuring yourself, how do you know that your program is being effective? And so we talked about having a best practice. Most groups have some sort of key performance indicator, those KPIs around at least an initial response cycle time. How quickly are you getting back to a reporter who calls in? What is your anonymous reporting rate? Are you making an effort to try and drive down that anonymous rate where you're actually converting people to identified reporters, which is a best practice because it helps the investigation. If you have an anonymous reporter, the investigator can't go back and obtain more information, and you're stuck with what comes in the door. But if we know who they are and we can build their trust that we will try to maintain confidentiality, which Jen will talk about in the next section, we just want to make sure we are keeping track of it and we're seeing how we're doing at this stage of the process. You do want to allow for anonymous reporting. There are some requirements around that. We have third-party resources where they can actually track if the person just wants to remain anonymous, but they've made known who they are. Third-party vendors who do the intake function can get back to them through an anonymized way. In-house groups may not have that capability, but you want some sort of follow-up communication with that person. You don't want to it's not a fire and forget missile where they just send in their matter and they are never heard from again. And so it is a best practice, even with an anonymous reporter, if there's some way to reach back to them and let them know that their matter is received and is being worked, that's a best practice. How much time? So there was much discussion around how quickly do you get back to somebody who's reporting it. The consensus of the group was within 48 hours or essentially 2 business days, that if something comes in on Friday, you want to be back to them either that day or the following Monday. That it's not waiting a long period of time, multiple days or a week or longer is not ideal, that it's letting the person know we have it will ensure confidence in the process. And likewise, talking about the non-retaliation policy is important. Again, as I mentioned, people are often fearful to step forward. It takes great courage to do so. And so you want to let them know that the company does have an anti-retaliation policy, that it's strictly enforced and it's taken seriously, and that if they experience any sort of retaliation that they perceive as retaliation, that they should report that as well, and the company will look into that. Next slide. And so what are the intake channels? So you don't want to have just one intake source, essentially. You want multiple intake channels because employees go to many different areas to do that. They may have walk-ins, either a hotline function or a web-based function. Some companies talked about having an automated function like through a mobile app, that sort of thing. But you want those multiple intake channels so that people can report how they feel comfortable. And you also want the appropriate language support, meaning if you are a multinational company, do you have support in the native language of where your employees reside, or is everything in English? And that may actually drive down the likelihood people are going to report. And so you want to flip that and increase the likelihood that employees will escalate issues to you, to your function within the company rather than going outside the company. And there's other ways to receive intake. It's not just a hotline. The member organizations, the working group folks talked about during recommitment. Oftentimes we see an increase after some sort of ethics recommitment event, or during an engagement survey, as Jen talked about, or even during exit interviews. As people are leaving the company, do you take the opportunity to hear them out as they're going out the door? You often get very candid feedback as people are leaving around, I'm leaving because of this or that happened, and you still want to follow up on those and conduct investigations on that, because oftentimes the employees who committed the misconduct or alleged misconduct are remaining within the company, even if the reporter is not staying with the company. We found as a consensus that most of the companies use some sort of third-party hotline function and even third-party case management systems versus either in-house or homegrown systems. And you'll see there on the screen the benefits that those companies talked about in terms of confidentiality of the data. You have a vendor who has the data, so truly the company doesn't know who reported in if it is anonymous, that the vendors are compliant with the various jurisdictions, especially if overseas, what there may be some in-country requirements that are there. There's local numbers, so that you do need to think about that some countries cannot call certain numbers. So what is your hotline number? Do you have operators who speak the native language, that sort of thing? And then is there the capability, some of these vendors have the SMS or the text ability to report things through other methods than just a phone call or an email or a web-based capability. Next slide. And then once a matter comes in, we talked about triaging a case. And you'll see there the best practices from our working group. Again, this is an overview. There's more detail in the paper. Surprisingly, this was an area I know I was surprised to see that most companies use dedicated staff to triage matters. And that's a good thing, because you want to try and assure similar case management. Again, we talked about consistency is key. You want people who are very skilled to issue spot and be able to assess the risk of the matter coming in and know where that matter should go. And be able to assign it consistently. And if you have a revolving door of people doing it, they're not going to know which group often handles those, who is best equipped, again, who has the most qualified personnel to do those. And so you want to consider using dedicated staff. And then you see there the intake triage process has some considerations, and these are ones we could reach consensus on. Essentially, that goes to just understanding, is this an issue or a trend that's occurring? Is it increasing? Is there a bigger issue at foot rather than just this one issue? Are you seeing the same name pop up or the same work area? Where if you have again, that rotating personnel doing these, they may not have in mind those commonalities. And so you want to look at what's the complexity. Essentially, the intake triage process is a risk assessment process. What do we have? How quickly does it need to be worked? Where does it need to go? Who's best to do it? And so those are some considerations up on the screen. Next slide. And then assigning a case. The working group members felt that there should be some sort of matrix formula or some sort of documented formula to help people should somebody step into that role, that there's a guidance document that says where things should go. These sorts of issues go to one group, these sorts of issues go to another. Where do they get assigned to? How do they get assigned? That sort of thing. We talked about having cross-functional roles, so having some checks and balances within so that there's never an accusation that a particular allegation was scuttled or swept under the rug, that you have teams or other groups who will triage across, or they rotate within. Again, that alignment or the unification of process was key, and that includes in the intake, triage, and assignment process. We talked about the electronic case management system. So this was an area where it was more the ideal than the reality. Everybody desired to have a single case management system, a centralized one, but many of the companies do not have that. And those who do have that, I think there was envy on the phone calls and when we met in person around those who have that. But ultimately, that is a best practice we should strive for, that we have some sort of organization or dedicated staff to manage the kind of oversight of that function, and that all of the investigative partners within your organization can access that and have access to the information, rather than have the siloed approach with different systems that other groups can't access. Ensuring that whatever notes are taken at intake get to the investigator. That was an area where we saw a potential gap, that the investigator may just get printed documents but not know the conversations of the person who called in. Again, we want to make sure we have the consistency. We want to have quality, balanced, comparable outcomes. Again, consistency is key, and just it's not just the investigator's work, which often on trainings and whatnot we focus on. This intake, triage, and assignment function is part of the investigation cycle, and you want to make sure there's consistency at this early stage, which is why we devoted a section to it. And so, Jen, I think you have program element 4.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So confidentiality is extraordinarily important for not just the integrity of the case itself, but to also promote the integrity of the program and to protect everyone involved against retaliation. And so through the investigative training process, you really need to impart the need to keep things very close to the vest, only provide information to those with a need to know in the spirit of the investigation, keep the number of involved parties, extraordinarily limited. Naturally, you can't promise absolute confidentiality. There might be something that happens in the course of the investigation where someone's identity has to be revealed, but you can assure that provided that the report is in good faith, and that the reporter is is innocent and not implicated in any way, that you will protect them. So there's a number of steps you really need to take in making sure that everyone understands the confidential nature of an investigation and where confidential information relative to that investigation, could potentially be inadvertently released, right? And so, best practices around redaction, preventing, email forwarding of very detailed case information. Those are just some of the things that we identified as a group that are just good practices to incorporate into your process. And to the extent that you're able to use a closed system for investigations and communication, that's ideal. But again, when releasing information, particularly at the conclusion of an investigation, I would say, for purposes of decision making, ascertaining disciplinary action, when if it has to go outside of the investigative circle, or even still, if it's staying within the investigative circle, you need enough detail to take disciplinary action. But again, to the extent that you can redact or create as much objectivity in that disciplinary process as possible, it's probably a good thing to do. Next page, Casey. And so retaliation is something that companies really battle with, and it's no matter what you do to develop a robust investigation process, train on confidentiality around investigations, assure that your position of zero tolerance on any form of retaliation for reports will not be tolerated. You're going to have feelings that there's some form of retaliation for reporting issues to an investigation function or through a hotline. It is what it is, and it is human nature. But by taking affirmative steps to safeguard confidentiality and safeguard the integrity of the process, you can go a long way towards creating a little more comfort in the notion that, perhaps your company is on top of it and means what it says, right? So, one of the things that you can do in addition to, integrity of process and confidentiality is, properly monitoring what's going on with your reporters. And don't forget witnesses. Witnesses, do us a big favor in investigations of, providing us with information, by virtue of being an innocent bystander. And, oftentimes, it comes to light that they've participated. So really making sure that the identities of these witnesses and other involved parties aren't disclosed. And if retaliation is alleged, just get on top of it, right? Making sure that you discipline for retaliation the same way you would instill discipline for the original, matter being investigated, and continuously, monitoring, checking in with the reporter 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road. I think, a lot of the participants felt that, this periodic monitoring, was really essential to, assuring that reporters and witnesses were not, negatively treated following an investigation, and giving them an opportunity to, to provide feedback on their, post investigation, experience. And I guess, with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jim. I guess we're already on program element 5.
Yeah, so program element 5 was really afterwards. So what do you do after the investigation? And the working group members felt that, getting rid of the bad apple, so to speak, was not enough. And the DOJ has certainly agreed with that more needs to be done for companies to try and evaluate what is going on within their organization. And one of those ways is to look at the root cause or the contributing factors of misconduct. Why, the why, understanding the why it's happening and how to prevent it. And the working group members, this is kind of the new frontier. Some groups had programs that had been in existence, but not for very long. Others were just developing. But it is an area that if you have not started to look at root cause or contributing factors, you need to move in that direction as a best practice, and especially considering that more explanation was given in the recent update to those fill-up factors, that there's an expectation by a DOJ that's being considered by an org. It's what are you going to do about it going forward, and how effective are you? So measuring, it's not good enough just to do the investigation, turn over the results, and there you have it. It's where are areas that you can prevent that? Again, DOJ evaluating the effectiveness of the program. Well, who conducts that? So we talked about that, and most companies use the investigators. They felt that investigators are in the best position. They're the ones with all the info. They've talked to all the people. They've evaluated all of the evidence, looked at the documents. They're in the best position to decide, in that particular case, what the contributing factors were that led to that. And if you want to drill down further and try and determine that ultimate root cause of the issue, that the investigators are best suited to do that. Now, you still can get some intelligence from the business as to what's happening out in the business related to the organization broadly. But when you're looking at the particular individualized investigation and the contributing factors, utilize your investigators for that. We talked about what is shared in terms of root cause. What are you looking at? Generally, we look at kind of the overarching data that's collected, but you can get very good information off of anecdotal case information. So yes, you have your databases that give you metrics and whatnot, but there may be some cases where you can glean some particular areas, some preventive actions, or even use those as examples to share throughout the organization through some of your ethics stories or whatnot. That it's a combination. It's not just about data. And if you've ever presented to leaders, as I have, you get the so what, and you need to be able to explain a story or tell a story. So you want to have the combo of both data as well as examples. And a single case management system is best for that, the group felt. Again, if groups aren't sharing, if they're siloing, if there's different systems, how are you going to know what one group sees in terms of insights, what one group sees in terms of information? That when you're really looking at root cause, if you can try and get to a single case management system or a single spreadsheet of information and glean those insights, that's best. Next slide. Data integrity was a concern of the working group. You need to have data integrity, especially if you're going to do this analysis. I mean, ultimately, what good, is it to have data and you can't rely upon it? That's that garbage in, garbage out that you see on the screen. If it's garbage, nobody's going to use it anyway, and then you're doing work for no reason. So you want to make sure there's integrity with that, and that requires some training of investigators if they're entering that, or if you have administrative support who's doing that they understand. Again, we talked about that single system helps in many different ways in terms of consistency, how often it's completed, what's the thoroughness of the data. If you have multiple organizations all doing it a different way, you can't ensure those things that you see on the screen. We've already talked about silos. You will get confusing and conflicting data if you have those silos. Groups talked about that on our calls. And then you see just some of the reasons to ensure that the data has that integrity. You'll identify where your deficiencies are in controls, for example, just the policy adherence, even within your own organization, how you're doing that, and ultimately for trends, because the leaders want to know trends. And if you don't have good data, you can't give good trends. And so next slide. And then we talked about how there was much interest from the working groups into how is the information reported, to who, how often, that sort of thing. And so it was a universal call. I think every member on the call said that top leaders they're hungry for those data analytics. They want preventive actions recommended. They want to understand what is happening in the business. And so if you've not been called to provide that, stand by, because you probably will. That is the kind of hot new trend, is having this root cause or contributing factors analysis. When you're sharing with leaders, we talked about having generalized and anonymized data. So you want to make sure that people can't look at a slide and see themselves in the slide. Just they are your employees, and you want to try to maintain that confidentiality as much as possible. But again, you want to have the mix. So the generalized and anonymized data, but you might be able to have some learnings from specific cases that you want to share to prove a point or to emphasize some controls that you put in place, best practice, so to speak, or a good example to show, to get buy-in from the leaders that, again, this just isn't a paper program, but it actually will help them if they listen to it and listen to your recommendations as a hotline and investigative function. And then you see some cadence there. There were 4 areas where we all agreed, pretty much everybody was doing these 4 things, looking at overall volume. So what do you have? What are the categories? What are the business units? Breaking it down that way. There's interest in leaders knowing the anonymous reporting rate. Again, that shows, do they trust coming forward and revealing their name, or do they want to remain anonymous? And again, for us as an area to try and convert people to identified reporters so that way we can interview them. What's the substantiation rate versus not substantiated, and what happened as a result, either the discipline and or other corrective actions such as training, retraining, that sort of thing. And most groups did quarterly report outs, but I don't think anybody went longer than 1 year on this. So you want to do regular, but probably not to the degree of monthly or something like that was the consensus. Next slide. I think, Jen, you have the wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So along with the discussions, we also executed a survey to gauge some of the essential elements of our existing investigation programs. And so we asked questions such as, how often does your organization report, on allegation trends? Who are your reports, prepared for? And this just gave us some benchmarking data to go alongside, what we felt was, a collective best practice with companies, some companies recognizing that their individual programs were, a work in progress, right? But these were elements that we felt were very essential. And to Jim's point, some of the hot trends now are around, measuring the performance of the program and setting yourself up for, report outs and predictive analytics, right? And so as you can see, different companies do things with either greater frequency or, there's an overall focus, there's various focuses as to who are the recipients of these metrics and these reports. I think as time goes on, there will be a fundamental shift to some of this, but this represented the sort of the as-is state of our collective, as of the date of the survey, which was several months ago. Next slide. And so, wrapping up, basically there is no one size fits all compliance or investigation program. It really is based on, what kind of budget you have, how big your company is, what are your risk factors, what are your exposures, making sure however, no matter what you decide in terms of scale, there are some fundamentals that, you should embrace. And as long as you embrace those fundamentals in one way or another, as it best suits your organization, you're going to end up with a program that's right size. So, urge everyone to consider the collective best practices that are discussed. Think about how you might enhance your program, learn from the experience of a lot of the working group members that bring years of experience to bear in these discussions. But then also, in the spirit of continuous improvement, both from a, best possible outcome for your company standpoint and in accordance with the DOJ standards, make sure you're always revisiting your program, looking to improve it however possible. Think about ways you can tweak it. It's hard. You can't just, open a box and plug and play a state-of-the-art investigation program, right away. I mean, it takes years to cultivate. So also don't get discouraged. There's a lot of people that you will have to talk to, a lot of support that you will need from executive and middle management, and just, an overall culture and tone of transparency and organizational trust that will need to be instituted. And with that, Jim, unless you have some final comments, I think we're ready to open it up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, well said. So Q&A. Casey, how would you like that to go? Through the chat or through audio?
I actually have one question from the chat. So if anyone wants to put any questions in the chat, it might be the easiest. So for the first one, they said, by investigations, is the group counting all investigations, such as all fraud, all associate misconduct, all HR, and all compliance investigations?
So I'll take that, Jim. Yes, it
Sure.
was all encompassing. When we talk about investigations, we talk about all types of reports. And the reason that we talk about all types of reports is because, one of the conclusions that the group came to was that siloed investigations are not ideal. You should have one concerted investigation protocol employed against all types of investigations, a common reporting system. And this way, you have, process integrity, and, you're also, you have the benefit of the metrics, right, flowing from those investigations. So yes, we do talk about investigations very broadly across all aspects of noncompliance.
Yeah, and along with that, the misconduct behavior can help point to other types of behavior. So if you have folks committing fraud, it suggests that there's a gap somewhere else, maybe around internal controls. HR-related issues can bleed over into EEO-type issues, which could bleed over into criminal activity. And so you want to have a holistic picture of all your allegations. And if you don't have that, that's what we talked about with the silos. There can be barriers to get that info from other groups, and you want to try to achieve that and strive for that. That's the best practice.
Great, thank you. It doesn't look like anyone else has any questions. We do have a few minutes. Does anyone have any feedback, any comments? Okay, so not at this time then, but if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I can always forward that over to Jen and Jim. But we'll go ahead and we'll close this out. So I just wanted to say thank you to both Jen and Jim, and then also the working group team for your hard work on this report. And thank you all for joining today's webinar. We definitely hope that you enjoyed today's presentation, and hope that you'll consider joining a future ECI working group. Just as a side note, I do have 2 new working groups that will be starting in early June. One is called Unconscious Bias in E&C, and the other is Compliance Auditing and Monitoring. These are limited to members only, and they're led by your E&C peers. And organizational and fellow members are they're allowed to join for free. Individual members will have to pay a small fee for it. Just again, they're typically 1 call a month. They last for about 8 months or so. And if anyone is interested, please feel free to reach out to me. I can provide more information on these 2 topics. But other than that, thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great day.